And in Vetiver, he includes several horrifying poems describing the butchery of the French generals when they tried to put down the Haitian Revolution in the early 1800s. Alfonso Urías is one of the outstanding writers of his generation in El Salvador, or indeed of Central America. And we're lucky to have him now in Canada. Born in Quetzaltepeque in 1940, he eventually moved to San Salvador, where he published works in reviews and newspapers with other members of what came to be known as the Generación Comprometida, and included authors such as Roque Dalton and Manlio Argueta. His literary output consists, at last count, because he's always producing, of 5 books of short stories, 2 novels, and 6 collections of poetry. Right from his first collection of short stories, and especially from his first book of poetry, Estados Sobrenaturales, his work has been characterized by its experimentation, capriciousness, ludic surprises, cryptic inclusions, references to pop culture, use of slang and ear for idiosyncratic and class nuances in language, frequent preferences for word and image clusters instead of linear reasoning, and fusion of poetry with prose, often in highly lyrical minificciones. Quijada Urías' life has always had both a politically committed and bohemian side, also very cosmopolitan background in a very different sense. He worked in a box factory in San Francisco, traveled through Latin America, admires jazz and the beats, and is drawn to Taoism and Buddhism. He was also forced to flee El Salvador in the early 1980s, first to Mexico City and then to Cuba and Nicaragua, and finally settled in Vancouver 10 years later. Since that time, he has continued to write, turning out books of poetry or prose every 2 or 3 years, taking his stylistics in a different direction in each one, continuing to explore. Now, I don't mean to say that he develops, he goes off on one tangent and then another. He explores out from his central style that I think was established in his first 2 books, and he explores off in different directions with each one. And the beauty of Lujuria Tropical is he decided to give himself completely to the Neo-Baroque style. He now spends about half the year in El Salvador. He's tried to go back there to live, but it's been too difficult. He keeps trying to go back there. So now he spends about half the year there in El Salvador, where he is a major figure in the national culture, and half the year in Vancouver, where he lives and works in virtual isolation. He's one of those people who, I talked to him on the phone a couple of years ago and asked him what he was doing, and he was working as a janitor in a church. Okay. This is a guy who goes back to El Salvador, and the Concultura publishers that say, give us your latest book, right? His stories and poems have been translated into Dutch, German, Russian, French, and English. Quijada Urías' short stories have always run the gamut of literary styles, from the documentary to the satirical, the surrealistic to nostalgic, the tour de force of linguistic invention to the elegiac. A number of stories from his 1979 collection, La fama infame del famoso Atrida, seem to move from an exuberant experimentation with stream of conscious narration and use of elements of magic realism into a tropical neo-baroque of verbal and imagistic arabesques with minimal plot, in which he constructed portraits of archetypal individuals with constellations of words. So here again you have this kind of thing of moving from kind of experimental prose, surrealism, magic realism, and then neo-baroque. The short story, Florencia Sanchez, is really an extended neo-baroque prose poem in homage to a woman who embodies the suffering and vitality of the Salvadoran peasant, constructed in 100-word sentences with minimal punctuation, and filled with regionalisms and indigenous usage from the Salvadoran countryside, yet framed in a highly literate and powerful language. I translated this short story for inclusion in my book, Latino Canada, a critical study of 10 Latin American writers of Canada, which also contained newly translated work of each of the authors studied. The fundamental challenges in translating this work were both lexical and syntactic. I had to consult a glossary of Salvadoran terms from the countryside that I was lucky enough to find in the back of an edition of short stories by Salvador Salazar Arrué, known as Salarrué, a Salvadoran journalist and writer of the first half of the 20th century who set most of his work in the Salvadoran countryside. And it actually has some similarity in some ways to some Quebec writers at the time. This kind of valorization of regional dialect. And who included both narration and conversation in regional dialect. And in addition, I had to ask the opinion of a close Salvadoran friend and writer, Salvador Torres Sasso, in order to decipher other dialectical expressions that I couldn't find in Salarrué, most of which came from Nahuatl-based indigenous languages. It was also necessary to closely study the grammatical structure of the long twining sentences, often with periodic onrushes or onrushing surges of words, to make sure they held together in English. Because generally English is not given to this kind of structure, but I absolutely wanted to preserve the sentence structure as is in English in order to convey, again, that strangeness. Again, as with de Rosiers, it was important to let some of the strangeness infiltrate the English text so that the reader could get a hint of the original, though not so it would be mistaken for some kind of costumbrista exoticism. This process occasionally involved equivalent changes in tone and language, the inclusion of slang and colloquialisms, equivalent ones that is, and above all, the maintaining of the involved sentence structure, which was essential to the work's aesthetic. Okay, so I'm going to read a passage, short passage in Spanish, and then the English translation, okay? Florencia Sánchez ha esperado al hijo que se fue y no volvió. Le ha echado tierra también al que vendió su ombligo y el ombligo de su raza por unos cuantos pesos, el que subió y ascendió y llegó muy lejos y nunca se acordó de ella, Florencia Sánchez, raíz de todas las raíces, anciana, bruja, ángel, vendedora de frijoles, cocinera de mixtamal, agricultora sabia, curtida por innumerables tragedias, sacerdotisa, puerta, vasija, cántaro, comal, entrada al cielo, ventana del infierno, llaga, madre de indios ciegos, abuela de 1000 nietos medio muertos, hermana de las gallinas, curadora de la titilguita, trabajadora incansable, operaria consumida en la fábrica Vampiros and Company, mujer de Pablo Jaguar, hija mayor del gran abuelo, cetrina, reloj frutal, anillo de bejuco, perfume de nopal, traje de ceniza, depositaria de toda la injusticia que los injustos dictaron para justificar su odio, su cruz con 2 fusiles cruzados. Florencia Sánchez, vieja como la noche del principio, la que sabe aguardar tras de una puerta soportando las cabronadas de la historia, los ultrajes, los puñetazos, las puteadas, el falso resplandor del país de la sonrisa. Cualquiera creerá que sos invento mío o que sos otro de mis grandes plagios de las fuentes más originales. Cualquiera creerá, pero vos y yo sabemos que eres real, de carne y hueso, Florencia Sánchez.